on Byzantium and Roman identity, in case you hadn't guessed, mainly from the 7th through to the 10th centuries. In this talk, I'm hoping to be able to introduce to you all Byzantium itself, since it's not an area of history that really gets covered much in most history curriculums. As well as introducing Byzantium, I hope to be able to show how we can use approaches developed in other areas of the social sciences and the humanities and apply them to the study of historical societies. In particular, we're going to be looking at ethnic and national identities in relation to Byzantium. So that's the aim of this talk. I'm not expecting you all to become experts in Byzantine history by any means, but hopefully if I can pique your interest in it and encourage you all to think about studying classical or medieval history in general, if you haven't already, I will consider it a success. So to kick things off, I was hoping we could get you to use Slido and note down a couple of terms or phrases maybe that spring to mind when someone asks you to think about the Romans or something Roman. What really comes to mind when you think about the Romans? Just 2 or 3 words or terms, and then we'll have a look at who are the Romans, and have 2 minutes for that. Brutal military force. Great.
Just to clarify for everyone who's asking, the code is on the screen, but it is Trinity Talk 6 to join the Slido.
We've got a massive selection of things. Great. Right. I think the ever-expanding cloud shows that we've all got lots of different things that come to mind when we think about the Romans. I think the big one that came up was empire, of course, the Roman Empire. And keep that in mind later on about this idea of empire and its importance. Roman Catholics also coming up, and lots of different things. So most of the time when someone mentions, although actually you've proven me wrong, so I'm very glad that you did that, but most of the time when people talk about the Romans, or when they think about the Romans, they perhaps think about something like the Colosseum in Rome, gladiators and great public monuments, which again have cropped up a couple of times. Or maybe they think about Latin, the Latin language, or Latin inscriptions. If you're from my neck of the woods, I see Hadrian's Wall there. Hadrian's Wall, the Emperor Hadrian, different emperors. And again, we've got Roman roads, I see, which is excellent. Built roads, infrastructure, aqueducts, baths, that sort of thing. Channeling Monty Python of what did the Romans ever do for us? All these sorts of things. Architecture, yes. But perhaps less commonly thought of when we think about Romans is things like big churches, something like Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. I'm very glad to see that Roman Catholics has come up, and Christianity as well, I see. So big cathedrals and the conversion of Europe and parts of the Middle East to Christianity is a big thing to do with the Romans. Also, I can't see it here, but Greek is actually something that's quite a Roman thing. Lots of Greek inscriptions, produced by the Romans, and Latin and Greek functioned as the two languages of the empire. And again, Christianity, a big thing. And if we can go back to the slide quickly. Thanks. And blitz through all of the images. So yeah, there we go. There's the Colosseum. Yeah, Latin, and a nice straight road in Ostia, which is near Rome. Then we've got Hagia Sophia and Greek inscription, and then finally a whopping great mosaic of Christ from Athens. And those last three images, Hagia Sophia, Greek inscriptions, and Christian imagery, really all come from what we would usually call the Byzantine Empire, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. But really, the question we have to ask is, what exactly is Byzantium? And really, the story of Byzantium, as you'll hopefully see from this animated map, is a story of what happens to the Roman Empire after the fall of Rome. And we tend really to think about Roman history as really coming to an end in the 5th century AD. The empire is beset by barbarians from the north and east. It abandons Britain, and then it gradually collapses in the face of incursions by the Huns, the Vandals, the Goths. The city of Rome itself gets sacked by Alaric and the Visigoths in 410 AD, and the empire limps on a little bit until its last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed in 476 by the Ostrogoths. And that's it. Bye-bye Romans. And you'll see that on the map just now. But things are never really that simple. And this narrative of Roman collapse and dismemberment by so-called barbarian peoples actually only applies to half of the empire. After countless years of civil war that took up most of the 3rd century AD, it was eventually realized over some time that managing such a massive territorial expanse from Britain to Egypt was simply too great a task for one emperor to do alone. The empire had simply become too unwieldy, and it was therefore split into an eastern and a western half. This was initially done in the year 293 under the Emperor Diocletian, and then after a period of reuniting and splitting apart again, it was eventually reunified by the Emperor Constantine, who's rather famous. He's most famous really for converting to Christianity, supposedly. He really decriminalized Christianity as a religion in the empire, and this began the process of Christianization over quite a long time. He also, importantly, in the year 330, founded a new imperial capital. And this city was initially called New Rome, which is very imaginative, but it was very quickly renamed in his honor as Constantinopolis, or City of Constantine, which is more famous in English as Constantinople. This city is now called Istanbul, and it was built on the site of a much older Greek settlement that was called Byzantium. After all this, the old problems still remained, however, and the empire was finally and permanently split in the year 395, with a Western empire at its capital at Ravenna, and an Eastern empire with its capital at Constantinople. And both of these had their own emperors, they had their own administrations and their own armies. And it's the Western empire that goes through a massive collapse in the 5th century. The Eastern Empire actually, and as we saw on the map earlier, largely remained intact, at least until the 7th century. And it's this 1,000-year period, really, between the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 until the end of the Eastern Roman Empire in 1453, which happens with the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks. This 1,000-year period is what we usually refer to when we talk about Byzantium. So One really important thing to emphasize when we talk about Byzantium is that it's really not a new state. It's not a new empire that appeared out of nowhere. It's really a term of convenience that's used by historians in order to distinguish this medieval phase of Roman history from its earlier classical or late antique phase. The term Byzantine itself only really came about in the 16th century, and it was derived from the earlier name of Constantinople, Byzantium, as I mentioned. And in many ways, this term Byzantine was used as a kind of mental distinction that was used to separate the classical Roman Empire, which in Western scholarship was seen as the progenitor of Western civilization, the Roman Empire. Separate that from this sort of mutant medieval Greek-speaking Eastern Empire, which was labeled as Byzantine, which has an unfortunate connotation nowadays to mean something that's overly complicated or bureaucratic. For the Byzantines themselves, though, and in people in the empire, it was just the Roman Empire. That's what they called it. And they were just Romans. They always referred to themselves as Romans. And the empire, since it was a direct continuation of the ancient empire, retained the same system of government. It retained its professional bureaucracy, its currency, its legal system. It had the Roman army, standing army, and it retained the Christian faith and church that Constantine had established. The population spoke Greek instead of Latin, which was largely a function of the fact that it was centered around the eastern parts of the empire. And as I mentioned, the Roman Empire from about the 2nd century AD was generally functionally bilingual between Greek and Latin. And Greek was the lingua franca in this area that would become the Byzantine Empire. So that's a very, very condensed version of the origin story of Byzantium. There's a lot more I could say about it, but that will probably take a whole series of lectures to cover. But the main point really is that the Byzantine Empire is the Roman Empire. Its capital was Constantinople. It was a Christian state, and it used the Greek language. And since it was the direct evolution, not even really the successor, but the direct evolution of the ancient Roman Empire, it retained most of the features of that empire with some changes, only to be expected over the course of 1,000 years. And really that Byzantine is a term of convenience used to distinguish it from the earlier period. And there's actually some discussion amongst historians nowadays as to whether we should even really continue using this term Byzantine, since it has some negative connotations in terms of othering this state as being not really Roman as compared to the Roman Empire as we would think of it. Personally, I'm more pragmatic. I think it's a useful term to have, since people generally know what you mean when you say Byzantine. They know when, where, and who you're talking about. So that's a very brief history of Byzantium, and we're going to move on to something a little bit different now, and namely, as I mentioned, how we can take the approaches and the theories developed in other areas of the humanities and the social sciences, these things that are developed to study modern societies, and how we can use them to further our understanding of historical societies, and in this case, ethnic and national identities. So on Slido, I want you guys to think about what is an ethnic identity, really, and what sort of things make it up? What are the ingredients that make up an ethnic or a national identity? I'll give you some time to put down your answers for that. Lots of responses. Shit, excellent. Excellent. That's brilliant. I think you've all covered just about everything really that generally goes into what modern sociologists and anthropologists would see as an ethnic identity. Language seems to come up quite a lot, yeah. So if we hop back over, we'll see what our general consensus amongst the scholarship is, and it really is conforming quite a lot to what you guys have said. So there we go. And since the Second World War, an ethnic identity is largely boiled down to a common language, which a lot of you mentioned. Common language is very important to a sense of a group identity. Shared history, again, shared idea of common ancestry. This is an idea of a descent from a particular group of people. Common symbols, so these are the really obvious things often, the type of clothes that different groups wear, the food that they eat, the art that they produce, those sort of things, belief systems, religious belief systems, and political belief systems as well. A sense of a common homeland and a common group name. These are all things that you guys very rightly picked out as being very important. It's also a different awareness of a difference with other groups is also very important. And oftentimes when studying historical societies, that's the thing that comes up most often as the most useful way of seeing how their identity functioned. Because often when you're writing within your own culture or your own society, it's difficult to think about what defines you and your ethnic or national identity until you start to think about really what it isn't or how you're different from other groups of people. So that crops up quite a lot in historical texts. And just to briefly touch on what the difference between an ethnic and a national identity is, it's fairly ill-defined, and there's several discussions within the literature as to where the dividing line between the two is. It generally boils down to national identities being more state-centered and focused than ethnic identity, and often national identities are predicated on certain technological and societal developments that are thought of as being particularly associated with modernity and modern history. So from the 17th century onwards, these are things like development of better communications, development of print media and other types of media, particular educational systems that develop and that are associated with particular political states. All these sorts of things are seen as being indicative of national identity as a growth out of ethnic identity. So thinking about all of these different things that make up an ethnic identity, if we accept that as the continuation of the Roman Empire, Byzantium and its people were Roman, we have to really start to question what exactly do we mean when we say that they're Roman? And what did they mean, really, when they thought about themselves as Romans? Who were these medieval Romans? Because they're different from the classical Romans. And in a bit, you're going to see an image, and I want you to look closely at it, and bearing in mind all of these different ingredients for an ethnic identity that we've looked at and that you came up with, and try and think, how do they apply to this image? Looking at the image, what does it tell you about what being a Roman in Byzantium meant? And really just say what you see, because everything in this image has a meaning and it's been included for a particular reason. So give you a bit of time on Slido. So there we go. and I'll give you a bit of context for it to help you along. So this is a mosaic. It's in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It's 12th century, and it shows in the center we've got the Virgin Mary with the infant Jesus, and on the left is the Emperor John Komnenos, and his Empress Irene is on the right, and they're both presenting gifts to the Virgin Mary. And the inscriptions, which even if you could, if you do understand the language, are really very difficult to read. They say, John, on the left says, John in Christ God, faithful emperor born in the purple, autocrat of the Romans, Komnenos. In the middle, it's abbreviated and it says Mother of God. And on the right, it says Irene, most pious empress. And just really have a look at it and what really stands out to you, and thinking about it as a symbol of Romanness. What does it tell you about these people? And don't worry if you're looking at it and thinking, oh my goodness, I don't know what to say. This is the sort of source criticism that you might encounter as a finalist undergrad. So after you've spent quite a lot of time, so don't worry if it seems a bit strange. I'm hoping that we've got some. Have we got Richard's answers on the Slido? I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to take away from the image. But...
We do. Shall I pop across to that, or give just another few seconds?
Yeah, give a bit more time, because it's there's a lot to take in. And there's
got some great responses. Wow, we really have got some amazing responses.
Good.
Okay, I'm going to pop across to the other screen now.
Great. Yeah, I'm very intrigued as to...
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. You've definitely risen to the challenge.
I'll just briefly scroll through them, and then I'll go back into them in more slowly. Okay.
Yeah. So, okay. Wow. Okay.
Some themes, and then I'll just go back up to the top.
Amazing. Yeah. That's a really that first one. Really good point about the size of things and the positioning of the people. Relative to each other, relative to the Virgin in the center. Wealth, opulence, really, really important. Their clothes are rather bling bling, if I can say. A lot of gold, a lot of purple dye, as it would have been. They're actually would have been made out of silk in reality, so that adds even more to it. And this sense of wealth and opulence and power was very much a part of what being a Roman meant. Christianity, yes, very religious, and the Virgin is at the center of things. She's the main one. Use of Catholicism to maintain power. Yeah, definitely use of religion to maintain power next to God. The positioning in Hagia Sophia, very important. This is a really, really important building. Shared name, calling themselves the Romans. It seems often can seem like a really obvious thing, right, that they have a shared name, but it is really important that this is emphasized, and that this is the state of the Romans, and these are the emperors, the rulers of the Romans. And again, yeah, the use of Greek instead of Latin as an identity that's worth something, that people want to be a part of. And that's again tied in with all of this copious displays of wealth, to show that they are in many ways seen as superior to other groups of people. Again, Christianity, yeah. Art and culture. Interesting point about the gender. There's a lot you could say about that, but I won't go into it. Religious, yeah, absolutely. Rules on God's behalf. Exactly. That's amazing. I am in awe. Because I have had final year undergrad classes and given them an image like this, and they sort of have rabbit in the headlights moments. Just to see so many of your ideas is really fantastic. So this is really a bit a potted version of all these different things that you mentioned. That by the 10th century, really, Roman identity in Byzantium had been tied really from the language that they used had changed from Latin to Greek, and actually from the 11th century, Greek itself started to be referred to as Romaikos, so the Roman language. They're no longer pagans. It's very, very Christian, very, very Christian. And being Roman and being Christian in the empire is almost seen as being synonymous. And that's something that really does stand out from that image, the importance of the Virgin and the infant Jesus, and also the positioning in Hagia Sophia, the cathedral. Anatolia, which is modern Turkey, most of modern Turkey, was beginning to be called Romania, not Romania, but similar, same sort of thing. Romania, actually the homeland of the Romans. Hangover from the classical past was this idea that the empire was supreme, the emperor was supreme, again tying into this sense of wealth and power and opulence that they are. And someone mentioned technological development. These sorts of mosaics you just don't really see so much anywhere else, and it's very, very small glass pieces. So very expensive, very difficult to produce. And the sense of being better, for want of a better term, and that the empire has the right to rule over all. That's a hangover from the classical Roman Empire, the idea that the Roman state is the universal empire. And this continues on in Byzantium, even when Byzantine state is basically just Constantinople itself. At the end, this sense of supremacy remains. And the idea that being a Roman is the antithesis of being barbarian. Barbarians were pagans or heretics. Romans were Christian or Orthodox Christians specifically. That Romanness and Romans lived according to laws, and barbarians lived according to custom. And this is the idea that Romanness is tied to civilization and order and law. And the other thing is that barbarians ate certain foods and they wore certain clothes, as we saw in the mosaic. They're wearing a lot of gold, a lot of silk. It's very refined clothing, we might say. And in their mind, that's what defined them. And as far as they're concerned, barbarians are all wearing furs and leathers out in the woods somewhere. Quite a snobbish attitude, if you want to put it like that. There's a nice little anecdote of an ambassador from the King Otto II of Saxony, who goes to Constantinople and tries to bring back a load of those silk gowns as souvenirs, really. And he basically gets stopped at customs trying to leave the city, and they get confiscated because he's not worthy as a Roman to wear those sort of clothes. So, yeah. And we've got on the next slide just another artifact here. So to just really hammer home certain things, this is a gold coin, as you can see. It's from the 10th century, and on the left you've got an image of Christ, and then on the back of the coin there's the two emperors at the time, Basil and Constantine. And again, we've got this very, very Christian, very religious imagery. Christ takes up the whole of the back of the coin. And if you think about coinage, how coinage is supposed to be indicative of the culture that's producing it, you have to think about the discussions that we have in this country about who is worthy of going on our coins and our notes, our banknotes, as representative of the country. We've got Christ taking up the entirety of the back of this coin, and then the two emperors, again, in these very refined, would have been silk robes with all of their jewelry, what looked like pearls dangling down, and they're literally supporting the cross between them. So they're not only being supported by Christ, but they themselves are supporting Christianity between the two of them, holding it up. And then the inscription is actually in Latin on the one side, and then a kind of hybrid. It's written in Greek letters. No, sorry, it's written in Latin letters, but the language is Greek, with the C being K, the Greek for and, as opposed to et. So we've got both Latin and Greek here, and the use of Latin is again indicative of this heritage of the empire. Is the minting of coins is sort of an institutional mechanism, and institutions tend to change a lot slower. So the institutions of the empire continue to use Latin in some respects, even when everything else was in Greek, and we can see that here. And it was actually taken as being showing this continuity with the past. So that's a brief idea of what Romanism in Byzantium is like. But a question I often get asked is, why does any of this matter? Why should anyone care about who these people were? And apart from the quite straightforward idea that gaining a better understanding of how people saw themselves helps us to better understand the culture of the empire and it's how its society changed and its internal politics, it's also very important for understanding how the empire reacted to external powers. And in the 10th century in particular, there are the three external powers that you see on the screen. First one, Bulgaria. If you're good with your geography, you'll know that Bulgaria, modern Bulgaria, is very, very close to where Byzantium was, very close to Constantinople. And they were in conflict quite a lot in the 10th century and before. And a lot of the conflicts revolved around whether the Bulgarian state had a right to exist as one thing, because the empire rules supreme, and also whether the Bulgar ruler ought to be called an emperor or not. Because in the mind of the Romans, there is only one empire and there is only one emperor of that empire. And that was a major source of conflict between them. With the Islamic world, from the 7th century onwards, Byzantium's eastern frontiers were dominated by various Islamic powers, often much more powerful than the empire itself. And over the centuries, by the 10th century, really, this process of conflict with Islamic powers to the east strengthened really the sense that being a Roman was being a Christian, and that was in opposition to Islam and being a Muslim. And in the 10th century, this tends to generate an idea of holy war, which gets perhaps picked up later on by the West. And this is also tied up with the sense that being a Roman is being a Christian. And with regards to Western powers in the 10th century, they're really starting to run with the idea of they are the ones who are the inheritors of Rome. They're the ones who have a rightful claim to the legacy of the Roman Empire. And if any of you study medieval or early modern history, you'll probably come across something called the Holy Roman Empire. And this is starting to get going really in the mid-10th century. And the Byzantine position towards that would have been largely the same as Voltaire's position in the 18th century, which is that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, because Byzantium was holy, it was Roman, and it was the only empire. So this is obviously quite a source of friction in the relationship between the West and the empire. And getting a sense of who these people were and how they saw themselves helps us with understanding more modern discussions around who has the right to claim the legacy of Byzantium, whether we take focus particularly on the Christian and the Orthodox side of things, or whether we focus much more on the Greek language end of things, or whether it's a question of empire and the inheritor of the imperial mantle. These all are continuing points of discussion amongst modern societies. And on the next slide, we'll see some headlines from an incident, shall we say, last year involving Hagia Sophia, which in July last year was converted into a mosque from a museum by the Turkish government. And this produced a massive amount of discussion within Turkey and Greece, and also in other Orthodox countries, as to who really has a claim on this building, this Byzantine, most Byzantine of structures, really. And the last one, why is this museum turned mosque at the center of a culture war? And really, to understand this culture war, we have to understand the culture that made the building in the first place. And I think I'll wrap up there. Thank you all so much for being here and for listening. And thank you for such insightful comments, and particularly on that image. I'm really, really very impressed, not to be patronizing or anything, but really, really good analysis of the source work. And I hope that you've learned something from this talk, and I hope that I've encouraged you a little bit to think about studying Byzantium, or have an idea of the sort of things that you can do with studying history at university level. It's quite a bit more than just memorizing dates or people.
Callan, thank you so much. That was amazing. I just can't believe the richness of this history, and also, well, how richly you explored it as well in such a short time, but also how rich the history is, and yet how little so many people know about it. And number one on that list is myself, who, haven't done a history degree. I'm thinking, how did I manage to study so much medieval Europe and always sort of see, the sort of the sack of Rome or events like that in their own context, and from a sort of non-Byzantine context. So before going any further, there's a couple of questions that relate partly to what I'm alluding to there, which is really about choices of study within history and doing history at university. So on that note, and then we'll move on to the sort of Byzantine related questions. If you to study history, do you have to study both ancient history and more modern day history, like 19th, 20th century? Can you basically choose?
That's a really important question, and it really depends on which university you're looking at and which history course you're looking at. Certain ones will limit you chronologically in certain ways. So, for instance, to speak from the Oxford perspective, the history course here at Oxford is just called history, but it's really modern history. And for Oxford, modern history means anything after 300 AD-ish. So you won't really be studying anything before that if you just do history here. But there is a degree, which is the one that I did, which is called Ancient and Modern History, and that lets you pick from everything. And also, like several other universities, Oxford, at least for the history degree, the straight history degree, places chronological restraints on, basically meaning that you have to pick one modern history module, one medieval history module, one early modern module, that sort of thing. So you really have to look at how the courses are structured, because it might end up that you don't have free reign over where and when you get to study what periods and what societies. So.
Brilliant, great advice. You should definitely drill down to course choices once you're beginning to apply, shouldn't you? If you studied classics, could you focus on Byzantium?
Yes, absolutely. I know plenty of classicists here who did various Byzantine modules. The key really would be that you would be approaching it from a slightly different angle that would be more culturally focused rather than historical, so to speak. But you definitely could, at least at Oxford. Again, you'd have to check with other university classics courses whether you could do that, but that's absolutely possible. And a lot of my colleagues came in through studying classics.
And on that note, although I'm going to take the question a little bit more widely than perhaps it was intended, there's a question, what sort of careers does a study of the classics, and I'm going to add the ancient world, tend to lead some students and readers to?
So there's so you can take two different approaches to this. You can either look at very specific things where, for instance, if you take this sort of research, you could eminently convert it into studying more modern societies and more modern ethnic identities. So there's the quite specific things depending on where you situate your study. Or there's the more general things which a history degree in most forms will teach you, which is very close source critique. So being able to deal with large amounts of information and being able to organize them. That's particularly good for things like the civil service and law in particular. I know probably more people who have done a history degree and then gone on to do law than I know people who've done law degrees to then go into do law. So these sorts of qualifications and careers that require lots of analysis of information and to be able to synthesize a lot of detail.
Great. It's quite strong advice sometimes, isn't it, for prospective lawyers, at least to consider not doing a law degree.
Yeah, it's kind of intuitive, but yeah.
Yeah. And then on this theme, sort of one more along the lines of the studying sort of classics or ancient theme. Do you need to study these sort of classical topics? Is it essential to have previous knowledge in Latin and Greek? And then by extension, my question added to that, would you mind my asking what languages you are familiar with?
So what languages I'm familiar with? So I know French, Latin, Greek, and a smattering of Arabic and Italian. But, and this is a massive caveat which relates to the question, when I started studying at Oxford, I only knew English and I'd only done GCSE French. So that answers your question, really.
Wow.
You absolutely don't need to have Latin or Greek to go into this. You can, there are, again, I can only really speak from Oxford, but you'd have to check other universities. You can start from scratch and learn them, and other languages as well. You don't even need to have done ancient history as a topic at A-level or GCSE, because I didn't. I think the earliest thing we did in A-level history was the French Revolution. So you absolutely don't need to have studied this before. You just have to have the passion and the drive to do it and the interest in it. And really these super-curricular activities is a great way of showing that you have that interest, even if you haven't studied it at school.
Wow, I think you've just partly answered actually a question that somebody has asked, but also I was wondering there, I mean, how did you learn so many languages? But I guess that's partly a question of passion along the way, is it?
A lot of hours. I'm not going to pretend and say it's the easiest thing in the world, but it's definitely possible. Yeah, it definitely
Brilliant.
is possible. And honestly, once you start going, I mean, once you've done Latin or Greek, the tools that you pick up in learning the one language really helps with all the rest. So.
Brilliant. Well, you've certainly conveyed that passion. I'm going to switch now to 3 questions that centre around definitions of Rome, Roman. I'm going to ask them actually at the same time because they're all sort of fairly similar. Why were they called Romans when the ethnicities and national variation was so different? And then a second one, isn't Roman a very broad term for a varying amount of inhabitants in the area? And how did they justify the title of Roman if they didn't control the city of Rome?
Yes. So, okay, there's a lot to unpack in those. Is there what was the first question? I'll
Sorry,
try and go through them in order.
I probably shouldn't have grouped them together. Let's just go back. Bear with me.
Why would they call Romans when the ethnicities and national
When there was so much variation of national.
So this goes into my actual research, which you can think of Romanness as kind of a super ethnic identity that encompasses really quite broad ideas. So this idea of the empire and the emperor, Christian identity, Greek language, and to various different degrees, is what constitutes a Roman identity in Byzantium. And then certain groups within the empire can be considered more or less Roman, depending on context. That's a bit complicated, but that's effectively how it works. And there was certainly a lot of variation within Byzantium itself. There's a large Armenian community, and you get different texts where certain authors will consider this Armenian community to be Roman because they're Christian, and a lot of them spoke Greek. Other authors, and at different times, will denigrate them really and say that they're Armenians. There's one of them that basically says you can't trust Armenians to be good watch people because they're basically not Romans, so they're not trustworthy. But these are different contexts where, again, all of these sort of things, these issues of identity, and particularly nowadays, we realize that they're eminently fluid and changeable. And
and
it's
kind of
very
malleable as well.
Yeah,
people can wield them, and and then the bit about justifying the title Roman if they didn't control specifically the city of Rome.
So this is actually one of the things that crops up, as you can imagine, when Western people traveled to Byzantium. And that guy I mentioned who had all of his souvenirs confiscated brings this up as well, of how can you possibly Roman when Rome is over in Italy and you don't control it. Actually, the empire did control Rome for a little bit until the 8th century. So it did control it for a little bit, but really Rome hadn't been the capital of the empire for quite some time by the time it split into two. And in any case, the Byzantine line, if you will, was that Constantine, when he founded Constantinople, transferred the Roman title and the Roman people to that city. It's a fiction, actually. It's invented by them to justify it. It's called Translatio Imperii, is the official name for it if you have any Latin. And that's how they justify it, basically. That it was given to them by Constantine.
Brilliant. And we've touched on this, we've alluded to it. Why did the Byzantine Empire really revive Greek studies and Roman law?
Oh, interesting. I perhaps wouldn't say it revived them as such, as that this was the natural progression of things, really. We have this Eastern Empire that's focused on the Eastern Mediterranean, which was largely Greek-speaking. Even by the time the Romans conquer this area in the 2nd century BC, Greek is the kind of lingua franca in this entire region. We've got Alexandria, for instance, major center of Greek scholarship, and that's in Egypt. And this whole area already spoke Greek. So it was almost a kind of a byproduct of having this split in the empire and kind of hiving off the Latin speaking side of things. It's kind of only natural that the Eastern side of things would gravitate more towards Greek. And you have various people in the 6th century really that complain about people not teaching Latin and not learning Latin in Constantinople anymore. The Emperor Justinian, I think, complains when he wants to write to the Pope that he can't find a decent translator anymore because people have stopped using Latin because everyone's speaking Greek.
How things change, eh? Did the idea of a Roman identity extend throughout all social strata, or was it an exclusively aristocratic idea?
Very good question. And that the answer to that will depend on who you ask. There are certain people who would argue very strongly that it was a quite exclusive identity and that it only really existed in Constantinople and it only really existed around the elite. I am of the view that it's much more pervasive than that, and that if you look at the mechanisms by which this identity would be propagated, so for instance, the church is a big one, the imperial legal system, the coinage, the army, all of these things build a sense of general identity and a common identity. And these extend throughout the entirety of the empire. The reason it's so contested is because when we look at this period in history in Byzantium, our source materials are not the best. So very often we are limited in what we can say to what was written in Constantinople and written by the elites, because obviously not everyone could read or write. So it's very difficult to get a sense of what's going on the ground. But and to make it perhaps more clear, there's an anecdote of a European traveler who went to Greece in the 18th century. And basically he traveled what's now Greece. It just was becoming an independent country. And he went, having studied all of this classical knowledge, expecting to find them basically the successors of Socrates and Plato. And he was a bit disappointed to find that actually they identified themselves as Romans still. And they thought that being Greek was not really something that you wanted to be. Because in Byzantium, if you called someone a Greek, you were basically calling them a pagan. And Roman was much more important. So if you think shepherds in 18th century Greece were still thinking of themselves as Roman and Christian, that it perhaps adds to the sense that this was the prevailing sense in the empire at the time. It's a dangerous line of argument to go down because obviously you can't really back it up, but yeah.
There's been so many amazing questions. We're not going to get through them all, but I'm going to conclude with three, if I may, with apologies to those who've asked a question that we don't come to, but I'm trying to get those that sort of group around themes. But firstly, for a very specific one, and I'll read this out in its entirety because I also like the way it's worded. Is Romania named after the Romans? Weird question, but you did mention it, but you mentioned it.
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to say anything because I don't really know much about Romanian history or Romania itself as a country. But yes, I would say that yes, it is named after the Romans. Romanian, the language, is actually a Romance language. So it's closely related to Italian and French. It's not really, I mean, you've got all the Slavic, Russian, Balkan languages around it, and Hungarian is a totally different thing. But Romanian is actually a Romance language. So there is a sense of...
Sorry, it also links in, Callan, with an absolutely beautiful graphic that Amanda showed in the previous talk when she was talking about linguistics, and I would urge people to have a look at that graphic. It's basically a tree of languages, and it was stunning visually. A really broad, sweeping question, but I was interested in how broad it is. Do you think that ethnic identities are variable in proportion with time? What remains the same and allows it to remain identifiable as a single entity? Identity.
That's a very good question. I would say yes, they are mutable and they change over time. But I think it requires certain things to be present in order for it to do so. You have to have the sort of drivers behind people wanting to identify themselves in a particular way. And with regards to Byzantium and Romanness, as I mentioned, the church was a big one. The sense of being a part of the empire was another one. And really once those disappeared, or at least once some of them disappeared and were replaced by other forces, then people's identities shifted. I mean, you only have to think about the area that was Byzantium is now modern Turkey. And it's not that the people just vanished, it's their identity shifted in response to external pressures and other factors, where they stopped considering themselves Roman and started to think of themselves as Turkish, or to pick another area, Arab for the areas that were lost, Egyptian. These were all once Roman, and they're not, quite clearly not anymore.
I'm going to squeeze in two more. One's very specific. It's about resources. One's then very, very generic about historian skills. Okay, so this is a bit more quickfire, Callan. Any recommendations of scholars who write on Byzantium and the Islamic world that you think would be particularly worth recommending?
So for Byzantium and the Islamic world, I would recommend looking at a historian called Hugh Kennedy. In particular, he's very good. He's mainly an Islamic historian, but he touches quite a lot on this period of shift between when Islam arrives on the scene and takes over this area that used to be part of Byzantium, part of the Roman Empire. He's very focused on that. Another one would be a man called Robert Hoyland. He, again, is very good on this particular period. And if you want a sense for how the Islamic world saw Byzantium, as opposed to how Byzantium saw the Islamic world, there's a really good book it's called, I can't remember what it's called, but it's by a woman called Nadia El-Sheikh. That's Elcheik, El-Sheikh. And it should be fairly easy to find. It's her major work.
Brilliant. Nadia El-Sheikh, Robert Hoyland, and Hugh Kennedy. Thank you. And then this is a big one, very broad, almost too broad to answer simply, but any tips for historians analyzing sources? Because these guys have done it so well this evening.
They really have. Okay, yeah. Basically, what I would start from the ground up is one of the key things. Is think about who is writing this, why they're writing it, who are they addressing it to, and what's the context that this is being produced in. Think about these sort of things before you then look at the specifics of what the text is saying, because it will give you a much better grounding and a much better understanding of why certain things are being said. And also, just don't be afraid to say things. In particular, I'm thinking in particular, if any of you are going to apply for history at Oxford, one of the interview tasks that you'll get given is a bunch of sources, and you'll be asked to discuss them. Also, the history aptitude test is very much focused on this, where you get given a bunch of sources that you've never seen before, and you have to write about them or talk about them in the interview. And basically just say, I like what all of you did with that image, which is so amazing how you all did that. Say what you see and what stands out to you from the text, and think why this. They're the best things when looking at sources. I hope that helps. Oh, Richard,
thank you so much. Some great tips there. That was a load of tips as well for a very, very broad question. Callan, thank you so much. You made that so accessible, so interesting, I think, and you've clearly enjoyed it. You really convey your passion, and I think from some of the questions you can clearly see that lots of our guests this evening have been pretty interested, and hopefully you thought further about our study of this period. Or any concluding comments from you, Callan?
Oh, I'm really thrilled to see so many people here and to see how engaged you all are and how interested in the subject you are, and carry that forward. And as I said, even if you've never studied this sort of thing before, but you think you really want to do it, just carry that interest forward and you can get there.
Well, thank you. That's a very positive note on which to end. We will send a link to the recording and also a PDF of the presentation delivered, and we'll get that out in the next, should be the next 24 hours once it's downloaded. And thank you all very much for joining us. Have a good evening.
Bye.